Start the first session. Welcome to the conference proper. We had our sort of inaugural yesterday. In the first session, we have Ana Celia, who's going to chair the session, Professor Ana Celia Castro, and I will now hand over the mic to her.
Well, thank you very much. I want to start by welcoming all of you to the Retrofit for Purpose Reform on International Finance Architecture, organized by IDEAS, the International Development Economics Associates, and by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro Institute of Economics. I welcome all the national and international participants in the name of Chandra, Jayati Ghosh, and Marga. Thank you very much. I will start. I do not have time. I prepare a long introduction to this fantastic professors, but I will not have the time, so I'll be very short. Okay, so I start by introducing Prabhat Patnaik. He's Professor Emeritus at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Well, as you all know, he's a prominent Indian economist and political commentator, known by his Marxist perspective. His works span a wide range of topics, including the dynamics of capitalism, the role of the state in economic development, and the impact of globalization in developing countries. He has a Bachelor of Philosophy and Doctor of Philosophy degrees from the University of Oxford, and also joined the Faculty of Economics and Politics of the University of Cambridge, UK, in 1969, and was elected a Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. In 1974, he returned to India as an associate professor at the new established Center for Economic Studies and Planning and the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Well, as you all know, his specialization is in macroeconomics and political economy, and had written several books that will not have the time to do it, to really mention them, but you will have all the information available. And there are some main fields: critique of neoliberalism, imperialism and globalization, the role of the state, economic crisis and capitalism, socialism and economic alternatives, agrarian niches and rural economy, financial liberalization and instability, inflation and employment. So there are so many things that would love to have the time to really explore this thing. I think that I give the floor to him, and then when introducing Jan Kregel, I'll do the same if you allow me to do it. Okay? Yeah, okay, much better.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to this audience. I'll begin by recollecting the fact that the 1960s and early 1970s witnessed, in my view, two very important counter-revolutions in economics. The first was, of course, the counter-revolution that resurrected the real balance effect of Pigou, which Pigou himself had repudiated afterwards, in order to re-establish the significance of the Walrasian equilibrium and to show Keynesianism as being essentially caused by the assumption of fixity of money wages. Now, this was against Keynes's own writings, which had clearly shown that the Walrasian equilibrium was a completely inappropriate way of looking at a capitalist economy if you have money being held as a form of wealth. The second counter-revolution to which I would like to draw your attention to, with which I'm concerned at the moment, and that is the counter-revolution relating to development economics. It actually argued that the dirigist regimes which had characterized post-colonial states were actually suboptimal from the point of view of these countries, that these countries would be much better off if they pursued economic strategies that were roughly neoliberal in their character. Now, this, of course, was led, saying this, I feel as if I'm committing a bit of patricide, because it was led by my PhD supervisor, Ian Little. But on the other hand, this is something which was financed by the OECD, and it acquired a great deal of currency subsequently. Now, the point is that it assumed, while the first counter-revolution really invoked Say's law, established Say's law, the second counter-revolution simply assumed the validity of Say's law. You do not have an argument for free trade. Indeed, every argument for free trade implicitly assumes Say's law. Because if you have a world economy that is demand constrained, then the argument for free trade simply breaks down. Imagine a world economy that is demand constrained. Then what it would mean is that, first of all, not all countries can gain from trade. Some may gain, but others would not. Secondly, it would mean that there is a conflict between countries, that actually each country would be trying to undercut the others in order to get a larger share for itself. So the idea that somehow trade improves the conditions of all is an idea that breaks down. Trade may improve the conditions of some countries, but not of others. And this struggle between countries, particularly between developing countries, is not only ethically repugnant, but what is more, it also means that each of them is constrained into carrying out process and product innovations which entail an increase in the rate of growth of labor productivity. Even countries that experience high GDP growth rates are countries where the rates of growth of labor productivity are so high that because of this intense competition between them and other countries in a world of relatively free trade, that you would find that the rate of growth of employment, which is the GDP growth rate minus the rate of growth of labor productivity, is not only small, but often lower than the rate of growth of the workforce. Therefore, the relative labor reserves, that is the labor reserves as a proportion of the total workforce, instead of diminishing, which should be a characteristic of development, actually start increasing. Even countries that experience high growth rates, high GDP growth rates, are countries where you find that the relative size of labor reserves tends to increase. Now, this has a number of implications. One obvious implication is that unemployment becomes acute, and in fact, poverty also, at least some aspects of poverty, certainly nutritional poverty, becomes worse, even though the country is experiencing high GDP growth rates. The other is that you find inequalities increasing, because obviously if relative size of labor reserves does not diminish, then the real wages don't tend to rise, and labor productivity is rising, therefore the share of surplus rises, and that is the root cause of the observed rise in inequality in all these countries. What is more, when you have an observed rise in inequality, this tends to precipitate eventually a crisis of the neoliberal order, because of the fact that the propensity to consume out of surplus is much less than the propensity to consume out of wages. So any increase in the size of the surplus gives rise to an ex ante overproduction crisis. This ex-ante overproduction crisis may be held back, may be countered briefly by asset price bubbles and so on, which can stimulate aggregate demand for a while. But on the other hand, with the collapse of the bubbles, the ex-ante overproduction crisis becomes an ex-post overproduction crisis, and therefore you have a tendency towards stagnation. This is the kind of thing which we have been witnessing in the world economy and its fallout in the case of a lot of third world economies. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that some third world economies may not have been doing very well, may not have even exhausted their labor reserves, but this is something which is true of the third world as a whole, and therefore it is true of a representative third world country, representative in the Marshallian sense of the term. But there is a further significant fact, and that is that actually if you have a country that is open to free trade and therefore perforce to free financial and capital flows, in that case, the role of the state goes down. That effectively you cannot have state intervention in demand management in such an economy because of the fact that state intervention in demand management requires state expenditure to be financed either by taxes on the rich who have a high propensity to save, as I mentioned earlier, or through a fiscal deficit. Both these ways of financing are anathema as far as globalized finance, international finance is concerned. So any country that actually tries to have state intervention in demand management in this form is a country that would find that there is an outflow of finance from its borders. In fact, this was originally became apparent when François Mitterrand actually tried a Keynesian set of measures in France upon coming to power, and of course fairly soon the franc collapsed and Mitterrand had to pull back. So this therefore means in some sense that, that the people of these countries become, as it were, objects who are left at the mercy of economic processes rather than being subjects who can then control their own economic destiny through political intervention by electing a kind of government that they would like. In other words, no matter what the kind of government is, they all pursue the same neoliberal policies as long as they remain caught within the movements of finance, and therefore the people cease to have any initiative, and therefore they actually become in some sense objects rather than the subjects that they had been promised they would become at the time of the anti-colonial struggle. Now, for these reasons, I believe, and particularly because of the crisis arising from the growing inequality, which actually accentuates the economic problem for the bulk of the population of these countries, I believe that when we talk of development, we really have to talk not of development finance for a neoliberal trajectory, but a development finance for an alternative trajectory. What should be the nature of this alternative trajectory? Now, I'd like to draw a distinction here between two different kinds of third world economies. The first kind, both, by the way, are demand constraints in the sense that the potential output of these economies is greater than the actual output that you find. But there are demand constrained third world economies which are foreign exchange constrained, particularly those which are subject to the debt stress, and there are demand-constrained economies that are not foreign exchange constrained because the inflow of foreign capital, inflow of foreign finance, net of amortization payments on accumulated debt is large enough to ensure that the ex-ante absorption, the excess of ex-ante absorption, there you are. the ex-ante absorption minus output is less than the net foreign financial inflows, net of amortization of debt. While the second case is one where you find that the ex-ante absorption minus output is less than, is greater than the foreign finance inflows, net of amortization. Now, each of these, it's perfectly possible. It's very easy for a country to move from case 1 to case 2. Suddenly you may find that something happens and capital starts flowing out, in which case a country that was sitting on top of fairly comfortable foreign exchange reserves suddenly finds itself reduced to a status where the foreign exchange reserves are dwindling rapidly, and it has to do something about it. A crisis arises. Now, as far as the first lot is concerned, that means countries which are demand constrained but not foreign exchange constrained, what you have to do is to make sure that the aim of development is that the labor reserves, the massive labor reserves which these countries have as a legacy of colonialism that impacted on them both through deindustrializing their economies as well as through taking out without quid pro quo a certain amount of economic surplus from them, both of which gave rise to these large labor reserves. These labor reserves are used up. Therefore, if the objective is that the labor reserves are used up, in that case, development, you see the very fact of the slack that they have, because they are demand constrained and not foreign exchange constrained, the very slack they have provides the real base for resource mobilization and therefore for development finance. I mean, the real resources are provided by the slack that they have, that therefore the state can actually mobilize wage goods, by which I don't just mean agricultural goods, I mean wage goods including education, healthcare and so on. The state can mobilize wage goods in order to increase employment, and this increase in employment should then be used for enlarging the stock of wage goods. So you can actually have a process of virtuous cycle whereby these countries can begin to use up the labor reserves that they have. As far as the second set is concerned, obviously there is no alternative to foreign exchange rationing. Foreign exchange rationing is a term by which I mean not just import controls, not just capital controls, controls on outflows of capital, but also an ordering of the priority of external debt repayments. In other words, external debt repayments must in fact have be ordered in such a way that some of them have priority while others can afford to wait. And this is something which of course would bring down the wrath of the creditors, but on the other hand, to my mind, there is no alternative to that kind of debt rescheduling. But foreign exchange rationing is much better than what is normally prescribed by the Bretton Woods institutions, because what they do is that in case number 2, what they would say is that reduce your ex-ante absorption through various austerity measures. Now, any reduction in ex-ante absorption not only reduces the demand for foreign exchange, it also reduces the demand for domestically produced goods. Therefore, it's a way of adjustment that is necessarily accompanied by a substantial rise in unemployment, a substantial increase in the magnitude of recession. As opposed to this, if you have direct foreign exchange control by having import controls, capital controls, and so on, in that case, not only does the domestic output not necessarily go down, it may even go up to the extent that some who are frustrated by not having access to foreign goods then start demanding domestic goods. It might actually even raise the domestic output, but certainly there is no obvious reason why it should reduce the domestic output. Therefore, foreign exchange rationing is a far more potent form of intervention in these economies than what is suggested by the Bretton Woods institutions. But of course, the point is that whatever we do in the short run, fundamentally there has to be an alternative arrangement, because after all, it's not just a question of overcoming the immediate crisis that these economies face, but you have to have an alternative arrangement. This alternative arrangement, the thrust of my remarks till now have been that autarky, the much derided term, is not only ethically preferable insofar as it doesn't pit one third world country against another, but autarky may actually give rise to the possibility of state intervention in enlarging demand, which actually would mean a larger aggregate demand not only domestically but at the world level. So oddly enough, autarky may raise, may loosen the world demand constraint to a much greater extent than neoliberalism does. And that being the case, I believe that large countries should try as far as possible to be self-reliant in their requirements. And of course they cannot be, because obviously there are some goods they can't produce, in which case they should actually try and enter into bilateral arrangements with other countries where the claims upon them that arise because of imports can be held over and can be bilaterally settled through appropriate exports. As far as small countries are concerned, I would like EU-type arrangements among them where there is labor mobility, but they are not open to free financial flows, they're not open to free trade flows. You have control on trade flows, control on financial flows, but within the union there is free labor mobility and of course a coordinated state intervention to ensure that the level of aggregate demand is high enough. Now all this is something which I believe constitutes, rather than an architecture of global architecture of finance, I believe this, namely various kind of small arrangements, would constitute the arrangement for the future. But the last point I want to make is that all this should not make one believe that automatically things are going to be better, people will become better off and so on. I would actually argue that to ensure that, there have to be a set of fundamental, universal, justiciable, constitutionally guaranteed economic rights for all citizens. These rights must be right to food, right to employment, right to free health care through a national health service, right to free education, right to old age pension and disability benefits. And all these, therefore, must constitute the priority of the government, and the government's hands must be tied by having them constitutionally enshrined. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It was just at the time very interesting proposals. I will have time to discuss them, and especially for putting people at the center of economic reasoning and policies. Then I think I must introduce myself. My name is Ana Celia Castro. I'm professor at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm also the director of the Brazilian School for Advanced Studies and the president of the Brazilian Forum for Advanced Studies. I'm very glad to be here. Now may I introduce Professor Jan Kregel. As you know, he's a prominent post-Keynesian economist known for his significant contributions to economic theory, particularly in financial instability, development economics, and the crucial role of institutions in the economic process. The ideas of John Maynard Keynes and Hyman Minsky heavily influenced his work. Kregel has established a solid academic relationship with Brazilian economists, having visited Brazil several times and worked closely with Fernando Cardim de Carvalho, Rogério Studart, and Lavínia Barros de Castro. Kregel also left his political influence in IBASE, working with Fernanda Carvalho and Betinho. Kregel works is characterized by a deep understanding of economic systems, complexity, and a commitment to addressing real-world economic problems through pragmatic and theoretical sound approaches. Kregel studied mainly at the University of Cambridge with John Robinson and Nicholas Calder, and at Rutgers University, his PhD, under the supervision of Paul Davidson. He is a life fellow of the Royal Economic Society in London, and in 2000, he co-founded the Other Canon. Remember that? The Other Canon, a center of network for heterodox economics research with principal founder and executive chairman Eric Heiner. Until 2007, he was the chief of the Policy Analysis and Development Branch of the Financing for Development Office of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Until 2004, he was a high-level expert in international finance and macroeconomics at New York Liaison Office of UNCTAD, essentially its chief economist. He held the chair of political economy at the University of Bologna for many years, and he is now being a professor of finance and development at Tallinn University of Technology, Estonia, since 2006. He has other things, professor of Johns Hopkins SAYS and at the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College. And his main themes is financial instability hypothesis, endogenous money, whole of uncertainty, development economics, Keynesian policies, critical neoclassical economics, institutional economics, Minskian analysis of crisis, sustainability and social equity, and economic methodologies. So now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Jan Kregel.
Thank you, Ana Celia. I would also like to add to one of my very good friends in Brazil, former good friends, Antonio Castro, who was a great influence on both domestic policy and also on our analysis of financial policies. We start out with a title which is Financing in an Unequal World, and you asked the question, or I asked myself the question, in starting out, what did we mean by an unequal world? And let's see if the unequal world will move. The unequal world is not moving. Yeah, where is the correct direction? This is... Oh, okay, there we go. Where do we start? Well, we always start with Adam Smith, because Adam Smith taught us everything that we would want to know, if we have time enough to actually go and read through the entire book. Now, this is probably going to shock you a little bit, but Smith was very clear about the causes for inequality in the world, and he states quite clearly that governments exist in order to do what? To defend the rich against the poor, to defend the property of the rich against the poor. And if governments do that, and the poor do not have property, obviously the interests in the government, well, the interests in the government are not creating a more equal economy and a more equal distribution of income. And the question that we have in front of us is basically whether or not policies to create development across all nations can in fact improve the conditions of all nations. In modern terminology, Bill Baumol talked about this in terms of convergence, in terms of development. And we discovered that in fact convergence, not surprisingly, does not occur, and it does not occur automatically, and it has not occurred in general historically. So the question that I'm going to try and pose is how we might rearrange or how we might understand how governments have maintained this inequality across nations, and in particular in terms of developed and developing countries. Now, let's try and, okay. If we look at the way economists have analyzed development theory, in the post-war period, I'm going to pick out 3 different strands. The first strand is going to be Keynes, and this is Keynes of the economic consequences of the peace. It's then going to be Rosenstein-Rodin, which we usually consider as the father of development economics or modern development economics. And then what I'm going to call the neoliberal Geneva school, what are called globalists, and a position which has been represented by a book, a recent book by Quinn Slobodian, which is called The Globalists, and gives the history of what I would call sort of the 5th column of neoliberalism, which actually takes off from Keynes' economic consequences of the peace. Oops, that's the wrong direction here. I'm not going to read out the quotations from the economic consequences of the peace. The problem is people don't read things anymore, so if this gets distributed, you'll have time to read it. The bottom line is what? Well, Keynes is saying his analysis of the post-war period was one in which the massive increases in income and wealth which had occurred throughout the 19th century were due basically as a result of the maldistribution of income, of inequality. Inequality was the source of the benefits that had been generated by the global economy. And what he's telling us is, he said, well, it's not clear that these conditions are going to persist after the war. And it's not clear that we're going to be able to recreate that possibility. Why? Because those people who have wealth may decide not to continue to invest it, and those people who are working to create the wealth for the wealthy may decide that they are no longer willing to do that. And if you look down at the bottom, he says that if this system breaks down, in fact, it might happen that the wealth of the rich may be confiscated. Keynes was a potential revolutionary. Now, the causes, Keynes says, of that increase in wealth, the immense accumulations of fixed capital, the benefit of mankind, were built up during the half century. It depended on its growth for this double bluff, as we said, the idea that the rich became rich if they decided not to behave as rich, but also that that system was predicated on the absence of the interference of frontiers, the absence of tariffs, the stability of the currency, the gold standard. And these are all conditions, interestingly enough, if you read Slobodian's book, these are all conditions which the globalists argue must be maintained after the First World War. So we have this very nice contradiction in post-war development theory. We have the globalists on one hand saying we want to go back to this system of inequality, and Keynes and development theorists saying that we would like to move in a different direction. Now that different direction is what? Well, it's at this point that we look at the map of Europe, pre and post. The problem which was created for development theorists and Rosenstein-Rodin after the war was the creation of all of these new nation states. And Rosenstein-Rodin tells us very clearly that he approached the problem of development as the attempt to design self-sufficient economic production in these new nation states. Even more interesting, and I refer to what Prabhat said previously in terms of the way we analyze development, that all of this came from his basic training in Austrian microtheory. Rosenstein-Rodin was not a macroeconomist, he was a microtheorist. And he proposed the big push, he proposed the big bang, he proposed Keynesian policies in order to generate domestic development in these new nation states as a result of the application of basic consumer theory, not in terms of Keynesian demand management. Again, this is a case people in general don't read directly what people write, but he tells us this very clearly. And again, I'm not going to read through the quotations. You have time to do this yourself if you look at the PowerPoint. Okay? If we now make the question, who won this debate between the globalists who are saying, let's go back to the world that Keynes can never be reproduced, and Rosenstein-Rodin, who says that we have to respect the new democratic decisions of these newly created nation states by providing self-sufficient domestic economies. I won't go so far as Prabhat did to talk about autarky, but basically this is what we mean by having a self-sufficient, coordinated nation state running or deciding its economic principles. The answer is that basically the globalists won. Why did the globalists win? The globalists said, we can counter the challenge to the old order by making sure that nation states cannot democratically decide alternative policies. And Slobodian makes reference to the work of Carl Schmitt, the idea imperium and dominium. He said what we have to do, what the globalists said we have to do, is we have to create these global economic laws to make sure that the economic laws, the rule of the market, dominates national political decisions. I've worked in the UN for a long time. Every UN document has a section that starts out by respecting the rule of law. The rule of law means what? Well, Adam Smith told us what the rule of law was. The rule of law is that governments defend the rich against the poor. And this is precisely what the post-war system did. If we look at the GATT was what? The imposition of free trade on the system. If you're a domestic economy and you get Prabhat as your advisor and Prabhat says, no, we should go to autarky, you say, oh, no, we have the GATT, we've signed up to the GATT treaty, we can't do that. There is a higher law which determines what our domestic policy is going to be. If we look at what was then called the IBRD, we'll talk about that more in a minute. The IBRD says that we want to reestablish international private property independently of national regulations, the free flow of capital, just as it was in the 19th century. And this is what the World Bank did. The IMF, well, as we know, in the end, Keynes insisted and insisted and insisted, gold will not be part of the post-war financial system. The gold standard does not work. We ended up with an ersatz gold standard in which the dollar was linked directly to gold, and the system as it was implemented became what? It became the idea of the IMF producing domestic economic programs which were independent of any sort of national democratic approval. Again, it was a higher law which determined what countries could do. If you wanted to sidestep and to take a different policy, the IMF could say, no, you can't do this. You have to negotiate. Martin is sitting there. I'm sure he has experience of negotiating with the IMF in terms of what you can do in domestic policy. And you ask the question, why is it possible for this autonomous, independent board that has nothing to do with national policy objectives or decisions gets the ability to determine what we do? Well, we signed up. We signed up to the IMF, and when we did that, we gave away our ability to introduce domestic self-sufficiency in terms of our economic policy. So my answer to that is, if we look out at the institutions we currently have, the globalists won. And that's why we have this problem of trying to determine how to produce financing for development in what is an unequal world. And basically the answer is because the structure that we've set up and we've accepted is one in which the world is unequal. Now, the last point which I want to make is that if we look at the discussions that took place around the creation of the IMF, the Bretton Woods systems, many of you know, every time you hear me speak, I talk about clearing unions as the alternative proposal. Part of that clearing union proposal, whether it came from Keynes or whether it came from US economists, Alvin Hansen and Gulick, or others such as Koleski and Shoemaker, was always to couple the clearing union with an international investment and development board. That is, these were two parts of the system that had to be introduced. Shoemaker and Koleski made important amendments to Keynes' clearing union proposal that created, I think, substantial improvements on that system. But the most important one was the creation of an international investment board or an international financing board. That is, the clearing union had the possibility not only of creating international purchasing power. I'm simply going to just go back and say, remember Schumpeter told us that this was something that anybody could do. You didn't need the clearing union to do it, but it had that potential. It also had the potential to use the debits and credit balances from international trade to be managed by the clearing union, and for the clearing union then to impose the distribution of the deficits and the surpluses in international trade. And one of the proposals was to say, well, if we have a clearing union, and you have a clearing union which has countries of different levels of development, you will probably have structural surpluses and deficits in those systems. How can we deal with those problems? And the answer was, first of all, multilateralizing those deficits in terms of this creation of an international investment pool represented by the deficit countries. But secondly, of managing that international investment pool such that the claims of the surplus countries on the deficit countries could be directed towards the deficit countries, so that the management of international capital flows, I'll link to Prabhat now in terms of foreign exchange, but here we don't have foreign exchange, we simply have credits. In the clearing union, you could direct those flows to those countries that were in deficit, and as a result of this, allow those countries to expand their ability to export and to increase the demand for surplus countries to import from the countries, so that the capital flow boards were not only boards to create additional development, but they were boards to deal with the problem of structural imbalances that would always result when you have countries at different, thank you, Jamal, at different levels of development in the economic system. So that the management of this international board basically is what should have been done at the World Bank, when the World Bank, as Keynes said, the bank and the fund were created backwards. That is, the nurse who gave birth to these things got confused, that the bank was really a fund, and the fund really should have been a bank. And the bank should have used its ability to direct that financing to those countries that needed to expand their development relative to the countries that were already developed. And have I run out of time? I've run out of time, so I will stop there. No, this is real. If you do the PowerPoint, it takes you 2 hours. If you just do the main points, you get done very quickly. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. I'll not make comments now because I'll leave them to the end of the session, and then I give the floor to you to raise questions and discuss and debate. I think that will really profit from the time giving the floor to the audience. Please, you can make questions and discuss the excellent proposals that have been posed here. Please. Talk. Yes? They are shy, all of them. Yes? Yes, exactly. Okay. Please say your name and organizations, please.
Yeah, Ahilan Kadirgama from the University of Jaffna. The question is to both Professor Patnaik and Professor Kregel. You know, Professor Patnaik's idea of a union of small states. Just one clarification, you said there should be labor mobility within those unions, but did you say there shouldn't be trade within those and financial flows within the union or from outside the union, if you could say that? And when we're thinking, but the broader question to both of you is, you know, can we sort of scale up from the unions to a global architecture, or what would be the challenges in going from that kind of a union to a kind of a global architecture? Thank you.
Should we collect 2 or 3? Or answer immediately? Yes. Jayati.
Hi, I'm Jayati Ghosh, and thank you both for predictably brilliant presentations. I actually just have a very kind of boring practical question. What are the possibilities today? What are the steps that we need to take to get to there? I mean, that's the world we want, and there's the world we have. So how do we get, what are the steps? Yeah. I love it. Yeah, maybe neutron bombs on all the major institutions.
No?
Okay, let them answer this and then we can come back.
Who is going to start?
Prabhat could start.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, there will be labor mobility. I believe inside the union, the different countries' currencies should be having a fixed exchange rate amongst themselves. There will be trade among them. But of course, there would be surpluses and deficits. But the surpluses and deficits would be carried over and settled bilaterally between these different countries without necessarily requiring the inflow of substantial amounts of finance in order to meet these deficits. Then your next question was, how does it get raised to the global level? I mean, I think it can get raised to the global level if you have a global government. If you could have a global government that could actually carry out Keynesian demand management at the global level, then of course there is no reason why, shall we say, Say's law should not apply at the global level. And if it does apply, then of course within that you can have the possibility of global full employment. But the way things now are is that is not possible. And therefore, I'm visualizing these unions of small states or very large states like India and China and so on, which are really kind of very large states, in which you can have state intervention in ensuring that the demand constraint system is converted to one which is, let us say, supply constrained. I mean, it will be full employment, but full employment that is full employment at wages which are given by the availability of the various goods, including of wage goods, including of the agricultural goods, and so on and so forth. But essentially, it would be a full employment economy. Jyoti's question, what are the possibilities? Well, you know, I mean, I visualize the possibilities emerging as a result of political struggles. I think political struggles are now beginning to arise within the third world, but I think these political struggles also must have a certain objective, clarity, some kind of a perspective on the world economy. And our job is really to debate about what this perspective would be like. And I think if we can carry this perspective to the struggles which are arising, I think that would be a good job.
Okay. If we look at the regional basis, again, Keynes made references to the possibility of applying the clearing union across different regions. The European Payments Union was one example of a regional payments clearing union, which more or less worked. Just as an aside, Richard Kahn had an alternative proposal to the way the EPU was running, which is extremely interesting to look at as an alternative. This is just, again, part of the role of being very old is that you remember all of these things that you studied years ago when we actually studied things and people forget about. So this is just a reminder that you can go back and look at. No one would credit Richard Kahn for having been one of the architects of the EPU, but in fact he was. The other example after the EPU is the European Union, which I didn't mention in my list of imperiums, but actually is another good representation of the globalist ability to impose theory, impose policy on the system. And this came about what? This came about as a result of the need to impose regional free trade and the requirement or the belief that the requirement was to have a single or a common currency. And if you ask any of the southern tier Mediterranean countries in the European Union whether this was a good idea or not, you will get probably a unanimous opinion that this was not a very good idea. Every time the Italian government tries to pass its budget, it discovers that in order to pass the budget, it has to go to Brussels and get approval of its budget. So again, this is this question of the rule of the market being dominant, and that also applies in terms of regions. If you go to the idea of scaling up, I'm very much doubtful that we will ever get to any kind of global governance. Again, having anybody who has experience working in any of the multinational financial institutions or the United Nations, you discover is that this is something that it's just never going to happen. Keynes himself, when he talked about supranational banks, gave that up quite quickly. The advantage of, that I insisted before, the advantage of the Kalecki-Schumacher proposals is that they are multilateral. Okay, multilateral in what sense? Well, these are governance which are not dominated by a per se government which is independent of national governments, but is a cooperation amongst national governments. So that the Schumacher proposal says that we don't have a global currency. Each country keeps its own currency. Each country's deficit or surplus goes into this global fund, and that global fund is not a bilateral relationship. That is, the creditors and the debtors can't say, you owe me the money because we have a trade imbalance. You say, I have a claim on the range of deficit countries. Okay? So what you're doing is trying to get a sort of intermediate position between individual national autonomy and some sort of supranational independent governance where everybody manages, so more or less. Now, in financial terms, this is simply diversification. What you're doing is you're saying you're trying to diversify responsibility for these issues between the national governments and some global governance. And this is the way I would see something coming forward. Now, as we've mentioned before, ASEAN started out as a potential for doing this. ASEAN, unfortunately, has not been as successful in providing the kinds of uniformity in terms of economic policy decisions that we might have hoped, and it has run into basic difficulties again in terms of political decision making. But that's the sort of intermediate level. I think there is a possibility of providing a solution. And basically, Jayeda's question is: Are we going to get a super global government? And my answer to that is no. Let's just forget about that and try to find something in between the two. And I think Koleski and Shoemaker at least provided with this idea of multilateralism, okay, which is different than multinationalism. We make that distinction, is a possibility.
Any other questions before final comments? Okay. This is also a side event of T20. And then I would like to make some remarks on this direction. Because the reform of international financial institutions has been one of the objectives of the G20, starting by India, now in Brazil, and next year in South Africa. So as we have the summit here in Brazil, I think that is an opportunity to present all the alternatives that are on the table discussing the international financial architecture. And I don't know if you know, but all the engagement groups, being the T20 one of them, have already presented the communiqué. The communiqués are ready. You can have them in the web page. And one of the task forces in the T20 is exactly the task force of reforming the financial architecture, international financial architecture, and the main contribution of this one is leverage affordable climate and sustainable development financing, including resources needed to promote just energy transition, meaning that we need a roadmap for reforming the multilateral development banks, optimize the access to multilateral climate funds, and also promote the contribution, the interaction between them, and propose innovative blended finance mechanisms to address existing finance gaps and market failures and to do risk investments. And some of these suggestions were made here. And I have the impression that the problem is how to take all these recommendations and take them to the G20, to the sharper track, instead of being confined in the engagement groups. Because we do have the engagement groups, but we don't have the governance of the engagement groups altogether, and how these proposals go to the summit, go to G20, to financial track, and other tracks of the summit. So I think that one thing is the how to achieve all these objectives and proposals here. And the second thing is how to implement them. So the months of August, September, and October will be the implementation phase of the recommendations for the G20. So I think that this is an important opportunity to develop these ideas in terms of implementation process and also a call for action. So this is my final question. So I think we should end now. I open the floor to you to have some final remarks, please.
Go ahead. I've said everything.
You said everything?
No, I don't have much to say, but you know, about this global government, I think a surrogate global government can be thought of where you don't actually have a global government. You have national governments who do their own management of the national economy, aiming towards full employment and so on. But at the same time, if they have balance of payments deficits, then it should be for the surplus countries to make adjustments so that these deficits disappear. I think that would be a kind of step towards a surrogate global government.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. And then we can pass to the other session. Thank you.
Stages where